Very good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us here on Upfront on the Joy News channel. Well, it's the 18th day of May 2023, a day after the IMF Executive Board approved Ghana's program. Now, it's been 10 months of negotiations. In July 2022, we began a process that sought to put the country's economy back on track. At the time, we had agreed that the economy was not the best. Well, in December 2022, we got a staff level agreement. And at the time, we celebrated and said, well, this was in record time. And we said we're doing everything possible to ensure that we actually get the board's approval. Then came the domestic debt exchange program. And I'm sure for many of you, it's one of the things that actually got you to realize that this much touted, much talked about IMF program was not going to be rosy after all. Well, we went through it and finally settled it in February 2023. And then we began discussions with our external creditors. Finally, last week, we got assurances from them that they wanted to take part in Ghana's debt exchange program. That paved way for the executive board to meet. And yesterday, finally, they approved our program. For many of you, you've heard the politicians, you've heard our managers of the economy consistently say, this is that one program that is going to transform the economy. Again, you heard them say, we're going through challenges because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're going through challenges because of what? COVID-19. Now, this afternoon, if you listen to the IMF's chief mission to Ghana, Stefan Rudet, he made a point, which is very instructive. He talked about Ghana having existing vulnerabilities, which, as a result of COVID-19 and other external shock, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we got exposed as a country. But now that we have the IMF program, we need to do a few things. Already, we're beginning to now understand fully the scope of the program and what it could mean for you and me, as in us. And what it could even mean for businesses. For many of us, once we see the cedi appreciating against the dollar, we say, this is what we're looking forward to, this is what we wanted, we have it, and then we say, that's it. But the governor of the Bank of Ghana has been warning us. He says, it is not just about the money, but it's also about everything in there and how we reset the Ghanaian economy post the program. What would that reset cost you and me? How will that reset cost businesses? And how will that reset cost the country? Well, if you're not familiar with the program says the government of Ghana decided to engage in programs that would lead to significant revenue increases. And the emphasis is on significant. So yes, we could have opted for expenditure cuts here and there. There are some expenditure cuts here and there which actually affect even employees. Because of course, we may have heard of a freeze, but now you're actually told we must even manage wage increases. This evening on Upfront, we're discussing the IMF deal. We're discussing it in detail, looking at what it means for you and why you should not be so excited about an IMF program. My name is Winston Amoah. And this evening, we're joined by economist and professor of economics at the University of Ghana Business School, Professor Lord Mensah. We're also joined by Mark Bedu-Abuaji, who is CEO of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we're joined by Gilbert Ado, who is Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory, Deloitte Ghana. Good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for making time to join me on Upfront on the Joy News channel this evening.
Good evening, Winston, and good evening to co-panelists out there.
Great. I'd love to start off with you, Professor Lord Mensah, because you're one of those who actually started this whole warning even before we got into the program eventually. But finally, we have the program, and I believe you've been doing some reading of Ghana's program. What is your take generally on our conditionalities?
Yeah, well, Winston, I would say that the conditionalities are not different from what we know. And generically, anytime we visit IMF, the conditions are that increase your revenue and then, cut down expenditure, possibly look out for expenditure savings. And clearly, government, started this before even we got a board program. We saw 3 revenue handles being introduced. And the point that clearly comes out from these, conditions is that we should be able to increase our revenue to 18.7% to GDP.
Yeah.
By the end of the program. As we speak now, in 2022, we're somewhere around, 15.7. But then, if you look at the revenue, handles that we have, streams that we have in this country, we have the non-oil revenue and then the oil revenue. And if you look at the increment, the projections that, government proposed to IMF before we got this program, clearly, it is the non-oil, revenue that we intend to increase more, over the years till we get, and what constitutes this non-oil revenue? We're talking about taxes. Revenue that, will be generated out of the human activities, business activities that, we engage in, or the economic agents engage in. So effectively, once, you hear taxes, then you should understand that disposable income, if you don't get a commensurable increase in salaries, then you should understand that your disposable income, as far as your consumption is concerned, will be coming down. Now we need to appreciate that going through this IMF program is a sacrifice. I always put it that way. It is a sacrifice which, we may have to realize a benefit along the line. And we always see economic transformation anytime we find ourselves with the IMF. No doubt about that. Anytime we engage the IMF, you see improvement in our inflation. You see improvement in stability in exchange rate, possibly exchange rate coming down. You see, interest rate coming down. And clearly, it tells you that with the IMF, I think we do better and we get economic transformation. But to sustain it becomes a problem. That
yes,
is,
but Prof, talking about this, and if you look at, beg your pardon, if you look at the program, paragraph 17, for instance, talks about the 2023 budget and its associated bills. But there's a point here. It says, look, containing the wage bill by limiting wage increases and hiring. Now, you have talked about how this could impact our disposable income because we're talking about taxes. However,
sure,
in here, we are told to actually limit, or we should contain wage bill by limiting the wage increases and hiring. So in one instance, your disposable income is going down, and then your salaries also are not increasing to make up for the reduction. How does that augur well for the Ghanaian worker who would be hit by these taxes?
That's a very good thing to look at. You see, I mentioned the sacrifices we have to make. And I mentioned earlier that if the taxes are going up and your wages are not increasing in commensurate with this, increment in the, taxes, you end up having your disposable income increase. And like I said earlier, this is a sacrificial program. To the ordinary citizen, to the government itself, because government is going to be squeezed, in its, expenditure lines. So effectively, we are going to take up some pain, and that pain must be rewarding, after the program. If we take up the pain and we don't get a reward out of it, that is where I would say the kind of pain we took has been in futility. But I'm praying that, like always, we get the economic structures, changed anytime we find with ourselves with IMF. Now, look, what is going to happen in the space is that for now that we find ourselves in the IMF program, we're going to get, economic activities shifted from the government corridors to the private sector. Why? Because government is going to reduce its expenditure. Right? If you look at, the conditions, clearly it states that government must look at, some expenditure cuts here and there. And through the reduction in expenditure, government will freeze, reduce borrowing on the, domestic market. And by so doing, the banks who have been investing in government bonds, taking into consideration the lessons they've learned, from the bond restructuring, which has cost them so much by reducing, their profit, will start diverting their attention from government investment in government instrument and then start lending to the private sector. So you see the private sector gradually getting active. And by so doing, private sector will start employing. We will take up the pain if we look at it, from the government corridors. Government is going to freeze employment. Government is going to make sure that salaries don't increase. But then, all these things are, some pain that we may have to endure to restructure the economy, to ensure that the private sector takes up the employment space. The private sector, starts allowing people to get more jobs to do. And by so doing, we find ourselves in certain levels of economic equilibrium.
Let me bring Gilbert in at this point in time, because you're a tax person, and if you look at our program, hinged so much on revenue increase. But even if you go to, for instance, paragraph 24, where it breaks it down, for instance, on the things that government intends to do. Gilbert, really, is this the kind of program that you would say is going to make the Ghanaian worker, individual better off, or we're going to take a hit as a result?
Okay, so Prof has already alluded to the fact that there has to be some sacrifices here and there from the citizenry in terms of these policy measures, and that will come by way of what? Taxes. Of course, it's not only going to affect individuals, but it's also going to affect industries. But we need to also focus on the long-term benefits. I mean, in terms of its impact on what economic development. What is very intriguing, if you look at the policy measures set out in paragraph 24, one talks about removing VAT exemptions. I mean, so there are some exemptions that have been granted for major constructions in the country, and some other sectors that are enjoying this exemption regime. Of course, I mean, because of some of these exemptions, sometimes by government sought to, implement what or pass into law the Exemptions Act that sought to streamline some of these arbitrary granting of exemptions to people or industries or some industries within the economy. Clearly, I think that there is that policy intent to ensure that this is managed well and curtailed in order to ensure that sufficient revenue is mobilized through indirect taxes. We have always talked about these exemptions, that are granted by government. Of course, this will create an efficient analysis of the exemption regime. Of course, there's a law that seeks to streamline some of these things. And I think that this policy will help to put government in check. And once it's able to put government in check, like Prof said, it opens up a certain revenue mobilization space. And it also helps in growing industries. We've been granting exemptions, and what this does to the local industry is also not to make them that competitive. So if you bring that equilibrium, it now creates that opportunity for these local industries to also grow. And as they grow, it creates the space for them to be able to recruit and also expand in terms of production and in terms of other financing models they tend to put in place. If you look at point 2, which is also very interesting, it looks at reforming the CIT, corporate income tax phase, by phasing out tax holidays and exemptions and strengthening safeguards against profit shifting. There's a clear policy intent to manage the base erosion and profit shifting strategies that are put in place by some multinationals who are operating within our space. This is also very important. I think that the Revenue Authority have been at the forefront with their transfer pricing audit in order to curtail some of these things. And I think that the IMF wants to ensure that government is placing much emphasis on some of these policy structures. For the exemption regime, it's already been talked about. It's been discussed extensively. What has to be done is the implementation. You know, we are good at bringing on board laws, but the implementation of same is very, very critical. And I would say that the Exemptions Act is a very good act that, if well harnessed, would help in raking in sufficient revenue for government as well as the economy. Reducing customs exemptions. I think government has already been at the forefront by taking out this benchmark discount policy that they have, which has created a whole lot of hula baloo within the industry. But it's also of very good importance that these things are looked at. But in as much as you seek to review some of these customs exemption regime, we need to also look at its impact on Ghanaian industries. Because they will also need the space to grow. So that critical assessment would have to be done. And not just say, because we need revenue, let's take this thing out. Of course, you will be managed by IMF. IMF will compel you to do this because you have not managed your physical space well. So do this. But then the cost-benefit analysis would have to be looked at. What is of a challenge to me is, I think, that point 4, increasing productivity in progressivity, in personal income taxes. Currently, the marginal rate is hovering around 35%. The extractive industry, their corporate income tax rate is 35%. So if the individual is being pegged to this extractive industry, it could be worrisome. It really could be worrisome. So
how worrisome can it be?
Good. Your disposable income is not increasing. Here lies the case. The tax rate is also increasing. The private sector is having challenges in doing business because the cost of doing business in Ghana has gone up astronomically. So if I don't have the base to be able to manage my cost, how then do I increase salaries? You understand me? So that point needs to be critically looked at. I'm waiting to see how this will play out because already there are laws that has been passed to increase the income tax band margin to 35% for some categories of income earners. And I'm looking at how some of these things will play out. So these are the issues that really come on top of my mind in terms of the issues that are being discussed.
Great. I'll get back to you, but let me bring in Mark Bedu-Abodje, at this point, because Mark, you represent, the Chamber of Industries, Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And for many of you at the time, you've been, hoping this deal would come in because you believed it was really going to help deal with some of the challenges, particularly when it comes to rate of inflation and the exchange rate. Haven't gone through the document. What is your position now?
Well, my position is that for a start, it's a good news because businesses operate in certain environments. That environment requires that inflation should come down. There should be stability in the foreign exchange market, policy rate coming down. So if all these things are in place, then businesses will begin to do well. So the reason why we were calling for this IMF deal is that we have, by and large, through our actions and inactions, mismanaged the economy to the extent that these variables were way above what is needed for every business to operate. And we've gotten to a level where on our own as a country, through our policies, we couldn't do anything to salvage the situation. And there was a need for us to go to IMF. That is why we went to IMF. So we are hoping that with IMF coming on board, there will be a substantial improvement in the business environment and also reduction in the cost of doing business as well. But that notwithstanding, we are also well aware that IMF policies and IMF bailout comes with conditionalities that sort of put everybody in a very tight corner. In fact, the road from now to probably the 3 years that we are looking for is going to be a very bumpy one. It's a road that, even though we expect an improvement in the environment, they're also likely to create other difficulties and economic severity for businesses as well. My colleague was largely talking about the taxes. We have also made it clear that some of the exemptions are not good, because even those who benefit from these exemptions, whatever profit they are making, they are easily repatriate them to their various countries, and we don't benefit from it. So we have called for a second look at the exemption, and that is what we are seeing now. However, the taxes that are also likely to come about because of this will also further worsen the situation. You know, prior to getting the deal, we have introduced the 3 taxes that we spoke about, that these taxes are going to increase the cost of production. And of course, we were forced to accept them because we wanted the IMF deal to come. The other taxes that are likely to come, and if you look at the document, IMF agreed that we are very weak in compliance. That is what we've been talking about. That compliance is key and recovery in increasing the tax revenue and also the tax revenue. It is not necessary that we should always introduce new taxes or increase the taxes of the rate of existing taxes. If you are able to ensure compliance, the likelihood that you will get more revenue is there. So in one of their recommendations, they clearly indicated that we should ensure compliance, and they cited the EVAT as an example, and as asking that we expand the EVAT to other institutions. For me, that is key and that is relevant. So we should look at that aspect of it in raising more revenue. That issue also in the Article 24 that my colleague was trying to expand is the automatic adjustment of fuel based on exchange rate and based on exchange rate and inflation. If the IMF is not able to bring down exchange rate and inflation in the near future, let's say 1 or 2 years, the likelihood that fuel prices will go up is there. And you know, in our country, anytime fuel prices goes up, it affects everybody and every activity in the country. So we should look at that. Unless we get a reduction in the exchange rate, that is going to be a difficult challenge for us. If you look at the monetary aspect of it and the exchange rate aspect of it, this is also of a great concern to businesses. And again, the document acknowledged that the increase in policy rate has had limited effectiveness on bringing down inflation. And in it, they are still recommending that there should be a tighter monetary policy, which means that policy rate is going to go up. Already, the cost of borrowing is high, among the highest in the whole world. Interest rates are likely to be 40 to 45%. Now, there's a recommendation to increase the policy rate from its current level of 29.5 to whatever level they are looking at. Definitely, we are going to push up the cost of borrowing, and it's going to affect businesses. And putting all these things together, we may in the end have gotten the IMF deal, but this potential negative impact on businesses is there. How do we mitigate this impact? That is where my concern is. So for me, I don't think that we should even jubilate over this. We should even celebrate this IMF achievement, because the things that we're supposed to do to have prevented us from going through all these difficulties, we didn't do it. Now IMF is now on board and telling us what we have to do. Definitely, anytime IMF comes, when Prof said, it is two-way affairs. Either you are supposed to increase revenue or reduce expenditure. But in this, what scares me is aggressive revenue mobilization activity. Anytime domestic revenue mobilization is aggressive, the impact is on business, because usually it is done through a lot of this taxation. So the way forward for me is not too good. We should be reflecting on what we were supposed to do that we didn't do. A sober reflection, I should say, and not to jubilate, because the businesses, as I have already said, even advising some of my our members, is to brace themselves up for a higher taxes and an increase in interest rate through this IMF product. And definitely, businesses are still going to be uncompetitive if you don't put in place measures to ensure that these conditionalities, their negative impact is mitigated. In the end, we may have gotten IMF deal, but some of the business that will not be able to survive, because most businesses in Ghana from the past year have gone through difficult moments and they are not resilient. Any little shock to the SMEs that we have will cause them to collapse.
Okay.
And these shocks of higher taxes and high interest rate, as huge as the shocks we had with COVID and that of the Russia-Ukraine war that we are crying, and may end up collapsing more businesses. And as has already been said, the private sector now should be the savior for people who are looking for jobs. Because government freeze unemployment shows that they can't employ. And also businesses that are supposed to expand to employ. We are putting in place all this impediment to make it difficult, extremely difficult, even for them to borrow and expand. And if you come back to what we have done to our financial system through the DDEP, in Ghana, close to about 90% of businesses get their funding from the banks, because the capital market is such a way that an SME in Ghana cannot go there because of some of the things that you have to meet, of which they cannot meet. So usually what they do is to go for debt financing from the banks. Now these banks are also bleeding due to this DDEP. They are what do you call it? Their balance sheet have largely been impaired, so they don't even have the money to be given out. So businesses that are even willing to even borrow at that high rate may even have to wait because the banks do not have these funds to be given to them. And the banks are also businesses that are also employing people. So it's more complicated than what we think. And as such, nobody should jubilate. We should be happy because we have it. It's going to bring some stability in the economy. But the way ahead of us is bumpy and businesses are going to suffer.
Let me bring in, Professor Lord Mensah, because Professor Mensah, you had made the point that, if you look at everything and today, because of the debt exchange, I mean, government may not be able to borrow so much from the domestic, market, and so would resort. So many of these banks would have to go to, private businesses. However, the reality is that the lending rates are high. So, Professor Lord Mensah, and the program is still urging Bank of Ghana to tighten the policy rate. How's that really going to lead, these banks into lending to the private sector, bearing in mind that they could still do treasury bills?
Right. You see, it's a program. And as we speak now, we are speaking based on certain levels of information we have. The program is dynamic. It's a 3-year program. At the end of the day, government's, appetite for borrowing on the domestic market has caused, this interest rate to stay up there without necessarily coming down. Now, let's look at what goes into determination of lending rate. We're talking about the domestic reference rate, the Ghana reference rate, and then a premium, which will be added on depending on the economic condition and also the borrower who is coming to, take up the funds. Now, clearly, you come to appreciate that the Ghana reference rate has 2 components, which are linearly determining the, loan rate. This is how the banks price their loan. We're talking about treasury bills. We're talking about, the monetary policy rate. Now, government reducing its budget deficit, which is part of the conditions on the IMF program, will indicate that being on the market is going to reduce. If you take this year alone, we can count the number of times government has been on the domestic market to borrow in a form of treasury bills. This is going to reduce completely. If it turns up to reduce, Banks who are investing in government money market instruments, banks who have been putting their money in other instruments that government has been, feeding on, will start turning up because government will not need this money anymore. The demand for funds at the corridors of government is going to reduce completely. And therefore, the lot of funds available. I do share my good friend Bedu Abuaji's concern that, liquidity is a problem as far as, the banks are concerned. But then in the end, the little that they will have no choice than to divert it to, the individual, borrowers. Now we're looking at tightening monetary policy in relation to, what we call it, the IMF, conditionalities. Now, if the policy rate, goes up, as we speak now, the real value of investment is negative. Whatever we are recording as, our policy rate for which will feed into, interest rate structures are abnormal. Until the policy rate becomes a par with treasury bill rate level or inflation. Let me put it that way. Until the policy rate comes a par with inflation, whatever we are recording is a non-starter. As we speak now, if the IMF is talking about increase in or tightening the monetary policy, it does not mean that we cannot reduce the monetary policy to a level where it will come to the point to which, inflation will be a par. So we are going through, economic reformation. And I believe that by the time...
But yes, Professor Mensah, well, the rate of inflation currently is at 41.2%.
Yes, but then obviously we may have to work out in such a way that the monetary policy committee knows it.
Yes, currently, based on your point, so currently it's at 41.2%. We want to say it come down. So we are maintaining, there's been a lot of conversations about whether or not we should even think of increasing, the policy rates. But, well, maybe those who call for it, being maintained may have it. We'll see how it goes finally. But so it doesn't look like, yes, in the next 3 months or so it's going to come down because we are still very much concerned about our high rates of inflation.
Of course, the IMF program came to meet a certain, structure of our economy. And we may have to ensure that over time, before the program kicks off completely. And remember, they are giving us the tranches of the funds based on a review. And, the economic indicators will determine whether they should extend the subsequent funds to us or not. Now, if it turns up that your economy is still having a structure where, your treasury bill rate is lower than inflation, it's a typical, negative economy you are managing. And so it is anticipated that, this policy rate and then the interest rate structures will be a par with inflation, and then we take off from there. But then whatever the case may be, over time, we're going to have a convergent point of the policy rate and that of the inflation.
Exactly, and that's the point. Over time, how soon will that time be? But before I get to Gilbert, who would have to leave us shortly, I'm sure you've you've read the part about automatically adjusting fuel levies, in tandem with exchange rate and inflation. What do you make of that?
Already our fuel prices are being adjusted based on exchange rate. What is on the market is a practice. We witness that anytime the global fuel prices goes up, we see an adjustment. The unfortunate thing is that when the global price comes down, it takes a longer time before we adjust it in our environment. So we are already practicing that.
Except that this time around, yes, we're practicing that, but we've always done the 2 weeks thing, so we would monitor the trends and do it. But as you were saying, at the point when the prices were going up, the city was depreciating very fast. We saw these oil marketing companies breaking away from the 2 weeks, increment period and doing it weekly. Now that you have these discussions going on, For many, the concern is if care is not taken, we probably could have weekly, and that could further put some burden on them, isn't it?
Yes, of course. It makes sense to look at it that way. But then in the end, I mean, we're looking at economic dynamics. It's not every time that you anticipate fuel price to go down. If you look at the global, to go up. If you look at the global outlook, as we speak now, there is, that possibility of fuel prices coming down in the next, few, months. So we shouldn't look at it as if, at the end of the day, prices are always going to go up, and then we get a quick adjustment from our oil marketing company. But then at the end of the day, when it comes down, how the response will be. And it's a policy. If it's a policy, the way and manner we adjust to it when it is going up, we should be able to do same when it is coming down.
Great. Let me just wrap it up with, Gilbert, and come back to you. So, Gilbert, you've talked about, phasing out tax holidays and all of that. But this is actually to give business a relief sometimes. Look, you invest a lot in setting up a business in a part of the world, and it is expected that, look, yes, Gilbert, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. So
I can hear you.
I'm asking you a question about your earlier submission about, phasing out tax holidays, which you think is a good thing and all of that. But I'm just asking you whether you've actually thought about it this way, that a lot of people spend so much money, starting businesses, and they're starting the business sometimes with even, certain challenges here and there. They're giving tax holidays so that the initial, profits that they may be getting, they could plow it back into the business, expand the business, and then they start paying these taxes. Now, if you say that you want to phase that out, wouldn't that, one, be a disincentive to businesses coming into the country, and two, actually hurt the growth of businesses?
Okay, thank you very much, Winston. That's a very good question. We need to look at this on a balancing scale measure. We've had these tax holidays in our tax provisions for quite some time now. Some time back, and we term that as industry concessions. I mean, for some of the industry that some entities operate. But in recent times, government sought to even impose a tax of 1% on those entities that are already enjoying these tax holidays or tax concessions. And in the 2023 budget, government sought to increase it to 5%. So, which industries are we placing the emphasis on to provide these tax holidays? Are we giving tax holidays for foreign direct investment, or entities who come in to set up and operate? Or is these tax holidays going to industries that are within our Ghanaian economy that we think that those industries must grow for us to derive the necessary benefit? I think that the mantra has been to make Ghana more of what a production economy other than a tax-driven economy. Have we been able to live by that mantra? It's very important.
Tell me, have we been able to live by it?
I don't think so, because if you look at the current situation in this country, where cost of doing business is up the roof, companies are struggling, and they're having challenges. You look at how the financial service sector is now. Access to funding or finance to do business is becoming more of a difficult situation for industries or companies, indigenous Ghanaian companies that seeks to grow. So it's very important that we look at this tax holiday regime in context. Government can say that, okay, we want to grow the manufacturing hub, or we want to grow the pharmaceutical industry. Therefore, we are giving them this, which is tailored towards growing local or indigenous Ghanaian companies. I'm not saying that we should overlook the fact that we should give some tax concessions to entities, foreign entities that want to operate within the Ghanaian space. But it always has to be looked at within context. It should be on a need basis and not on a wholesale basis. So you need to look at the policy, evaluate the existing policies that existed. How has it fared? Has it been able to help indigenous industries to grow? even for foreign entities that came to do business in Ghana? What was the policy narrative? Has that been achieved? Because the bottom line is to grow the Ghanaian economy, and every economy must grow based on its indigenous companies. We have a lot of these big companies, Toyota and others, that grew within their local industry by getting government support and government subventions that has enabled them to even go global. How many Ghanaian manufacturing companies have been able to go global?
Okay, let me bring, please hold on for me. Let me just bring, Mark Bedouabaji in at this point, because I'm sure you have a lot to say about this. Mark, Gilbert is suggesting that maybe we should look at it on a needs basis, a thing, and not just have a wholesale tax holiday. You are into industry, you're into commerce. Now, he's also supported the, phasing out of the customs exemption regime. What's your take on these two?
Well, I totally agree with him when it comes to the review, because with that we'll be able to know the extent to which this thing has positively impact on businesses. It's to a large extent have been abused in certain circles, that companies will benefit from it, and when it gets to the time for them to pay, they change their name or they change their form, and then either they do a new company or they run away. So for me, for every policy, there is a need for us to regularly review it, so that we'll be able to know the positive and the negatives, and to come out with recommendations that will help both the businesses and the economy as well. So we are looking at it in totality of this policy and its impact on businesses and also that of the economy. What we are looking for is an economy that is strong and resilient enough, and businesses are benefiting from some of these policies to help the economy to expand. So for me, it shouldn't be wholesale, even with exemption. I mean, we should have a look at it. There are certain industries that may require some exemption when it comes to importation of machinery and raw materials. If you take, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry, of which we have competitive advantage, if there is a way to give certain companies exemption when it comes to some of their raw materials and machinery, I think that is fair. But to make it a wholesale, and those who are benefiting, the economy is not getting any positive thing from them, I think we need to look at it. For me, that is my position on that. Regarding the other question was with the benchmark value. The contradiction for me there was that we are an economy that is seeking to add value to raw materials, an economy that is seeking to manufacture more than importing. And that is the way out, because if you look at a typical manufacturing company, the value chain is long, from those who are providing the raw materials to those who are marketing. Within there are nodes that can employ a lot of people. So the focus should be on manufacturing company. So if there are policies that will be inimical to the manufacturing companies, we need to look at it. And I have said that our trade policies are more of revenue generation than trade facilitation. So if you go to the port, you are likely to see over 22 taxes and levies, and the aim is for the government to generate revenue. Makes it difficult for people even to import raw materials and add value to it. So if you are making it relatively easier for them, then the economy will benefit. Now go to the port and you realize that the number of containers that have been coming there have significantly reduced because of these levies and taxes. And what is happening is that now most of them are going through Togo and also Cote d'Ivoire. They have open warehouses there, they take their goods there, and then they bring them in beach. So the revenue that you are seeking to get from the port, by which you have increased and introduces new levies, you are not getting, which means that the Togo and Cote d'Ivoire ports are not very attractive, and you are not getting the revenue. So we should look at some of these policies that we introduce. We need revenue, fine, but the extent to which these revenue generation policies impact on business activities must also be looked at. So for me, that is my point at this time. There shouldn't be wholesale policies that people can take advantage of, but let's review it regularly and ensure that we get value for money with some of these policies.
Okay, let me just say thank you to you, Gilbert Addo. You would have to leave us. We're grateful that you made time to join us. Gilbert Addo, who is Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory at Deloitte Ghana. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll soon be joined by Seth Chumakwaboah, who is CEO of the Association of Ghana Industries. He'll be sharing his thoughts also on what he makes of the IMF program. But let me just find out from you, Professor Lord Mensah, because the issue of tax holidays and exemptions have come up strongly. Mark seems to have issues with how it's been implemented. Yes, he supports the review and has some few concerns. What's your take? If you can unmute your microphone so we can hear you.
Yeah, Winston, can you hear me, please?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Good. You see, taxes are of policies, and out of it, the government generates revenue. Now, industries go through dynamics. If you have a policy, how dynamic is your policy? We may have to look at that. You can have a policy, probably tax policy, that probably exempts, maybe pharmaceutical inputs. At this moment, you need them so much. But whilst, you are taking up this revenue through their import, you look at how you can enhance domestic production of this input over time. And so I always ask myself that we shouldn't make our tax, policy so rigid. And Gilbert termed it wholesale. So rigid to the extent that we cannot vary them. Because if you are giving exemptions to, auto industry as we speak now, a time will come that with a policy of ensuring having, domestic auto, production, you may not need, that kind of, policy anymore because you have, cars being produced in-house. So effectively, we should be able to look at how dynamic our policies are and then the needs of the country at any point in time. Because if you have, a policy and you make it so rigid for 5 years, within the 5 years, so many things can change. The country can empower itself to produce in a certain, direction. The country can empower itself to the extent of, enhancing domestic production, to move away from importing this item.
Okay.
And then in a way to save, even foreign exchange. So for me, the way and manner we've been implementing our tax policies and the handles and how we keep on moving them as and when government needs money, they try to, fidget and then put a tax policy somewhere that they think they can get more money, but then also having more impact, on, businesses. Effectively, taxes are there to help, government, but taxes are supposed to also, be able to help citizenry and at the same time, businesses. So if a business is important and at the end of the day, government takes up, this revenue through taxes and government is able to build up, good roads, we can have effective transportation for businesses. In a way, it has, an indirect kind of positive impact. So whilst, we're getting that kind of negative impact through the taxes, these businesses may also benefit through, the good roads that are going to be provided. So It's kind of a balancing act. By a situation where government, keeps on increasing the taxes, but then we're not getting commensurable shocks in the, infrastructure that is supposed to be provided by government, to cushion the typical, businessman out of, his, in-house or in-country movement of goods and services. That is when you will have complaints from, the businesses.
Okay.
But as we speak now, I can tell you that, government needs to be quite, dynamic with their policies, We shouldn't be so rigid on the policies.
Great. Let me see if I have Seth Akwah joining us as the CEO of Association of Ghana Industries. Seth, good evening. Can you hear me? Seth, if you can unmute so we can hear you. Good evening, Seth. Can you hear me?
Yes, good evening. I can hear you.
Great, Seth. So tell us. I mean, you've been reading parts of the program, particularly those that would concern you. What's your take of Ghana's program, the policies and objectives of the program? I mean, you've read it now. What's your take on it?
Well, thank you very much. I think first of all, we all welcome the news that IMF intervention has finally come into pass, and we are expecting some revenue injection from the IMF. We believe that as we have this intervention, it will help stabilize our macroeconomic environment. I think the major challenge we've had over the past year is the instability in the macroeconomic environment, the confidence level that we've been struggling with, which is affecting investment, affecting business planning and all that. So with the IMF intervention, I believe this is going to help a great deal. So that is positive. On the other hand, it also comes with conditionalities, and we are experiencing some already. All the debt exchange that we had, it's part of the conditionalities. The costs going up as a result of tax increments and all that is also part of the conditionalities. So all these are also areas that we need to look at. It's making us a bit uncomfortable in that area, but we need it. We needed IMF intervention badly in order to bring stability. So, it has its pros and cons, but generally speaking, it's a positive development.
Well, talking about pros and cons, one of the issues that has come up strongly is, for instance, phasing out tax holidays and some exemptions. For you in industry, tax holidays are good when you're setting up. There's sometimes, based on the sector within which you are, you have certain exemptions when it comes to the importation of raw materials into this country to manufacture. If we lose that, how's that going to impact you?
I think people need to understand these exemption issues very well. There's so much talk about it. Sometimes I get a bit worried. It's probably because we do not manage our exemption regime very well. And that's the reason why we have all this negative talk about exemption. But exemptions are a critical part of business development and industrial development. If you are bringing machines to process goods and you are not selling the machines, why should you pay duty on it? Everywhere in the world, when you are bringing machines for further production and you are not selling it, it's not machines for sale, you don't pay duty on it. After all, the duty should come on items that you are making further additional income on it. The company importing the machinery is not going to sell it to make money. It's going to use to produce. And when you produce, you pay the taxes on the products and the revenue you have generated afterwards. So we call something pre-production tax. You should be doing more post-production than pre-production. Same thing applies to raw materials. If you are importing raw materials for further processing, why should you pay tax on it? In some countries, you don't pay tax. Of course, one will argue that the extent of value addition is important. If it's a semi-finished product that the value addition is so small and then you are not paying tax, then that becomes unfair. But we can all calculate that, and there's a way of defining it. Once it's defined as a raw material, then it should be exempted. So I think that if we want to take out the exemption because of the IMF intervention, that would be very unfair. Also bear in mind that the IMF intervention, we believe, should not compromise or should not be industry should not be sacrificed by the author of the IMF intervention. Because when we do that, how are we going to create the jobs? The IMF program says maybe reduce or limit rate increases, limit employment in the government sector. Well, who is going to absorb the rest of the people? Isn't it the private sector? So if you bring in taxes and you don't provide exemption that encourages local production so that the industries will expand and absorb these numbers, how are you going to create the jobs? So I think that the exemptions are very critical and we shouldn't wish it away. And we shouldn't say just because we have an IMF intervention, we are taking away the exemption. I think what is important is to evaluate it carefully and critically and make sure that those who deserve it, they actually get it, and they get it on time.
Okay. Well, that's all time would allow us. Thank you very much, Seth Akwah, CEO of the Association of Ghana Industry. Thank you also, Mark Bedwabwaje, who is CEO of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And thank you, Professor Lord Mensah, who's at the University of Ghana Business School. I heard from Gilbert Addo, who's Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory of Deloitte Ghana. My name is Winston Amoah. On behalf of the team, thank you very much for joining us, and make sure you tune in tomorrow into the Super Morning Show on Joy 99.7 FM, where I will be. Up next is Joy News Prime.